Imagine standing in the heavy, choking smoke of a funeral pyre. You see a young woman, draped in red silk that clings to her trembling frame. As she climbs onto the smouldering logs where her dead husband lies, her bare feet sink into the ash. Her eyes are wide, empty, or perhaps resigned. Around her, neighbors, family, and priests stand watching, waiting. Some are weeping softly. Others are chanting prayers. No one moves to stop what comes next, because this was what society expected. As the fire is lit, the flames crawl up her robes, licking at her skin, consuming her hair, her breath, her screams. This was not an isolated horror. It was a systematic cultural practice in parts of India for centuries. It was called Sati, or Sati, a ritual where widows were burned alive on their husband's funeral pyre, following him into death, whether they wished to or not. Some stepped onto the pyre willingly, driven by the crushing weight of tradition, family honor, and fear of spiritual condemnation if they refused. Others were drugged, tied down, or forced into the flames by the hands of those they once trusted. This is the story of Sati, the ritual that turned grief into fire and widows into ash. Before it became an act of fire and screaming flesh, before it became a ritual that burned young women alive under the weight of expectation, Sati was a name. A name tied to a goddess whose story, twisted through centuries, would ignite pyres across India and leave ashes that still stain its soil. The word Sati comes from the goddess Sati, the first wife of the Hindu god Shiva. Her story is ancient, rooted deep in the folds of myth, where gods and mortals often exchange places, and where pain is born from the pride of men. Sati was a devoted wife, a goddess of loyalty and purity. Her father, Daksha, a powerful king among the celestial beings, despised Shiva. His son, in law, the god of destruction and rebirth, who roamed the cremation grounds, adorned with ash and snakes, dancing madly under the moon. When Daksha held a grand yajna, a ritual sacrifice to the gods, he invited every deity, every noble, every spirit of the cosmos, except Shiva. Sati, humiliated by her father's public insult of her husband, burned with a rage and grief so deep it swallowed her. She threw herself into the sacred fire, offering her own body as the price of defiance against her father's arrogance. The fire consumed her, leaving Shiva shattered in grief, draping the cosmos in mourning, forcing the world to pause in the shadow of his loss. It is a tragic tale of love, pride, and cosmic consequence. But as centuries rolled forward, the echoes of this myth hardened into a weapon, a tool that would be used to justify the burning of mortal women on the funeral pyres of their husbands. By the 4th century CE, references to the act of a widow immolating herself appear in historical records. The Gupta Empire, often remembered as India's golden age of art and learning, was also an age when the seeds of Sati were quietly planted in the soil of societal expectations. In some texts, the act was spoken of with reverence, a widow's final sacrifice to follow her husband into the next life, a sign of unwavering devotion, a testament to purity so absolute that even fire could not destroy it. But these were words written by men, in a world ruled by men, for the benefit of men. Hindu texts and scriptures, layered with the complexities of regional beliefs and interpretations, did not universally command the practice. Some spoke of it as an ideal, others condemned it as murder. Some kings and local rulers encouraged it, seeing in the flames not just spiritual devotion, but a method to preserve property lines and remove the burden of supporting widows, who, in the eyes of many, had lost their worth once their husbands died. For in many corners of society, a woman without a husband became an echo, a shadow, stripped of identity, of dignity, of a future. She was believed to carry misfortune, her very existence seen as an embarrassment to the family. Her presence in a home was a reminder of death, of bad luck, of incomplete karma. And so, the flames of Sati were stoked, not always by the widow herself, but by the whispered expectations of families who would remind her, over and over, that it was her duty, her dharma, to follow her husband in death. They would tell her that if she chose not to burn, she would be cursed to wander the earth as a ghost, or worse, face countless lifetimes of suffering, forever separated from her beloved husband in the endless cycles of reincarnation. They would tell her that the fire was a gateway to liberation, to heaven, to purity, and that her refusal would bring shame upon her children, upon her family, upon the memory of the man who had died. The practice spread unevenly across the subcontinent. It was never a universal law, nor was it a pillar of Hinduism, as some would later claim. Instead, it was a dark undercurrent, encouraged in some regions, condemned in others, hidden in plain sight beneath the justifications of purity and religious devotion. In Rajasthan, where the Rajput warrior culture prized honor above all else, Sati took on the form of Johar during sieges, where women would throw themselves into mass fires rather than face capture and violation by invading armies. In Bengal, the ritual often occurred in public spaces, a spectacle where entire villages would gather to watch, chanting prayers as a young woman climbed onto the pyre, her red bridal robes fluttering in the hot wind, the scent of ghee and sandalwood mixing with the smell of burning flesh. Accounts from travelers, merchants, and eventually British colonial officials paint a chilling picture. They describe processions where the widow was led to the funeral pyre, sometimes willingly, often trembling in fear, surrounded by chanting priests and onlookers who pressed closer for a better view. She would be given gifts, blessings, sometimes opium to numb her senses, and in some cases, promises of rewards for her family. In the crowd, there would be those who wept quietly, and those who cheered as the flames rose higher, praising her as a Sati Mata, a pure mother, an embodiment of divine devotion. Once on the pyre, there was no escape. If she tried to flee, she was often pushed back into the flames by relatives or priests, ensuring that the ritual was completed, that the family's honor was preserved, that the spectacle did not end in disgrace. Witnesses tell of screams that echoed across the fields, of women trying to claw their way out of the burning logs, of the air thick with the scent of burning skin and hair. They tell of families watching silently, waiting for the flames to quiet, leaving nothing but ash and charred bones that would later be collected, placed in small urns, and sometimes worshipped as relics of purity. In the eyes of many, the widow who burned became a goddess in death, a martyr for the sanctity of family and faith. Her death was celebrated, not mourned. Her ashes were considered sacred. But beneath the chants and prayers lay the harsh truth. Many of these women did not want to die. They were trapped in a ritual born from a distorted interpretation of myth and scripture, trapped by the iron grip of patriarchy that saw their lives as expendable, their deaths as useful. And yet, despite the darkness of the flames, not all stood silent. Across the centuries, voices rose in protest. Some local leaders and spiritual figures condemned the practice as murder, as a corruption of faith, as an abomination in the eyes of the gods. They argued that the goddess Sati's act was one of divine protest, not an example to be forced upon mortal women. They pointed to scriptures that spoke of compassion, of life, of the sanctity of the human soul. But tradition, once wrapped in the cloth of religion and cemented by social pressure, is not easily undone. And so, the fires continued to burn. They burned in hidden groves, in crowded fields, beside rivers where the ashes would be swept away, leaving behind the illusion of sanctity, washing away the evidence of the screams that once tore through the morning air. They burned as society watched, and the flames reflected in the eyes of young girls who were taught from the earliest days of their lives that they existed for their husbands, that in his death their own life's purpose ended. They burned until foreign rulers and Indian reformers began to push back, forcing the society that clung to Sati to face the truth of what it had become. A ritual of death masquerading as devotion. But that comes later. For now, understand this: Sati was not simply a ritual. It was a complex, brutal reflection of a world where women were born into a prison of expectations, where religion was used to justify horror, and where the myth of a goddess's sacrifice was twisted into a tool of oppression that consumed thousands of women in the name of purity. The flames of Sati, once lit, would not be easily extinguished, and in those flames, the stories of countless women were turned to ash, carried away by the wind, leaving behind only silence and smoke. Death came, as it always does, quiet or sudden, leaving behind the echo of a husband's breath, a family in mourning, and a widow whose life, in the eyes of many, was now as good as over. In the villages and cities where Sati was practiced, the news of a man's death did not only mark the preparation of his funeral, it marked the beginning of the widow's final journey, a journey toward the flames. She was expected, not by law, but by tradition and the weight of countless eyes, to follow him into death. Not in spirit, not in mourning alone, but with her own body, consumed in the same fire that would devour his. They dressed her for death as if dressing her for a wedding. Red bridal robes, the color of blood and marriage, were draped around her frail shoulders. Her hair was combed and oiled, flowers entwined into her braids. Jewelry placed on her wrists and ankles, so they would chime softly with every trembling step. She took toward the pyre. They adorned her like a bride for the flames. Crowds would gather, neighbors, priests, family members, even children, forming a ring around the funeral pyre as it was built layer by layer from logs and ghee-soaked wood. For many it was a spectacle, an act of devotion, they said, a sign of purity, they said, a performance to confirm to the community that honor was being preserved, that the family's name remained unblemished. Drums might beat slowly, chants might rise and fall with the wind, and in the center stood the widow, her face hidden behind a red veil, her eyes empty or brimming with tears, her breath shaking as she inhaled the smoke from the smoldering wood that would soon become her final bed. Some women walked into the flames willingly, but even the word willingly is twisted here. What is choice when your community tells you your life no longer has value? What is choice when your family reminds you that you are a burden, that the gods expect your sacrifice, that your children will be cursed if you refuse? What is choice when you have been raised to believe that the only way to protect your husband's soul and your own is to burn with him? So they stepped onto the pyre, climbing carefully so as not to stumble, guided by the priests who murmured prayers as the smoke thickened around them. They would lie down beside their husband's lifeless body, the scent of sandalwood mixing with the cold stink of death, and wait as the flames were lit. They would try to remain still, to embody the image of purity expected of them. But fire does not respect ritual, and as the heat rose, many would scream, flailing in agony as the flames wrapped around their legs, their robes catching fire, their jewelry melting onto their skin. And there were others, those who did not walk willingly, those who trembled, who pleaded, who tried to flee. For them, the ritual took on a darker, even more brutal face. They were drugged with opium to dull their fear, to quiet their screams before the fire began its work. They were tied with ropes to the pyre, their wrists and ankles bound, so they could not escape as the flames rose higher. In some accounts, heavy logs were placed on their chests or limbs to pin them down, ensuring they would not rise screaming from the flames, disrupting the spectacle for the watching crowd. Priests and family members would stand close, ready to push them back into the fire if they tried to crawl out, branding iron rods in hand to force them back into the flames. Because the ritual could not be interrupted. Because the community's honor could not be risked. For the onlookers, it was a moment of collective reformation, a brutal performance of tradition watched with tears, with reverence, with a sick curiosity that made them lean closer to see the flames dance, to hear the final screams of the woman they once called daughter, sister, mother. And when it was over, when the fire had done its work, there was silence. Only the crackle of wood and the low, dry sound of bones collapsing in the ash remained. The crowds would leave, satisfied that the ritual had been fulfilled. A family would collect the ashes, sometimes sifting through them to find pieces of jewelry or bones, now considered relics of purity, of devotion. The children of the woman, if she had any, would be told that their mother was a goddess now, that she had given them honor through her death, that she had burned for them. And the cycle would continue, generation after generation, each pyre feeding the next with the promise of purity through suffering, of devotion proven only through the flame. It was not law that bound these women to the pyre. It was expectation, fear, and the crushing weight of tradition. Whispered from mother to daughter, enforced by fathers, priests, and the community, until a woman's life was no longer hers to live or to keep. This was how Sati was practiced. In daylight, in front of neighbors and gods, with chants, with drums, with red robes, and with fire. It was a ritual that burned women alive in the name of honor. And it left behind only ash, silence, and the faint, haunting echo of screams carried on the wind. Why would a society demand fire as proof of devotion? Why would families watch their daughters, sisters, and mothers walk into flames, whispering prayers as the smoke swallowed them? To understand why Sati endured, you must first understand the weight of belief and the crushing silence of expectation that wrapped around a widow like an invisible shroud, even before the red robes and the funeral pyre touched her skin. Cultural reasons in many communities, it was believed that when a woman burned on her husband's funeral pyre, she was not just dying, she was purifying. Her sacrifice was seen as a cleansing fire that would wash away the sins of her husband, the sins of the family, and even the sins of the generations yet to come. Her death was considered a final act of loyalty, sealing her place in the afterlife alongside her husband, ensuring that she would not be reborn into a world of suffering and separation. In a society deeply tied to the cycles of karma and rebirth, this promise of spiritual salvation was not a small thing. It was everything. Women were taught, often from childhood, that widowhood was the worst fate that could befall them, worse even than death itself. A widow was a symbol of bad luck, her very presence considered inauspicious, a shadow cast upon weddings, festivals, and even the daily prayers of her family. Sati was presented to these women as an escape from that shadow, a promise that in death they could reclaim the honor that widowhood would strip away from them in life. It was, they were told, the ultimate act of devotion, a final offering that would grant them purity, ensure their husband's peace in the afterlife, and cleanse the family's spiritual debts. But the promise of spiritual salvation was only part of the reason the flames continued to burn. Social reasons for many families, a widow was not just a reminder of death, but a burden they could not bear. She could not remarry, could not easily return to her parents' home, and often had no means of supporting herself. Her presence meant another mouth to feed, another body to clothe, a constant reminder of the family's tragedy. In a society where resources were scarce and honor was fragile, a widow could become an inconvenience. Her survival meant dealing with the stigma that surrounded her, the whispered superstitions, the fear that her presence would bring misfortune upon the family. Widowhood often meant isolation. Widows were sometimes forced to shave their heads, wear plain white clothing, and leave apart from the rest of the family, stripped of color, joy, and dignity, marked as living symbols of death. The practice of sati became a way to avoid this. It was seen as a method of preserving family honor, of avoiding the shame that came with having a widow in the home. It ensured that property and inheritance remained clean, undivided, free from the complications of a widow's continued presence. And for the community, each act of sati was a reaffirmation of tradition, a spectacle that reinforced the social order and reminded everyone of the roles they were expected to play. Those who spoke against it were often silenced, accused of impiety, of weakening the bonds that held society together. Those who tried to stop it were seen as enemies of faith, outsiders who did not understand the sacred bond between a wife and her husband, even in death. And so the flames were fed by more than wood and ghee. They were fed by belief, by fear, by the crushing weight of social expectation, by the whispers that a woman's life was worth less than a family's honor, that her death was a small price to pay for purity and spiritual salvation. For many women, the choice was no choice at all. To refuse sati was to accept a life of humiliation, poverty, and isolation. A life where every breath was a reminder that she had failed in her final duty as a wife. To accept sati was to embrace death with the hope that, in the flames, she might find freedom, honor, and peace. This is why the fires continued to burn. Because in a world shaped by these beliefs, the screams of burning women were drowned out by the chants of those who believed they were witnessing a sacred act, by the silence of those too afraid to speak, and by the traditions that turned death into a ritual, and a woman's suffering into a spectacle of honor. The story of Sati is not a distant myth lost to the dusty corners of forgotten centuries. It is not just an echo in ancient texts or a dark legend whispered by the elders. It is a story that clawed its way into modernity, burning women alive within living memory. It was October 1987, when the quiet village of Durala in Rajasthan awoke to smoke rising into the pale morning sky. A thick column of ash twisting into the air as the villagers gathered around a funeral pyre. The flames were not unusual. In rural India, the cremation of the dead was a part of life, a ritual as old as the soil itself. But this was not just another cremation. This was the burning of Roop Kanwar. Roop was just 18 years old, a widow for barely a day. Her husband, Mal Singh, had died the day before. He was 24. Their marriage, like so many others, had been arranged, their lives tied together in the quiet ceremonies of tradition. Their fates interlocked before they had truly begun to live. And now, as his lifeless body was prepared for the pyre, the villagers' attention turned to Roop. They say she walked calmly to the pyre, draped in red bridal robes, her face hidden beneath a veil, her feet bare and silent against the dust. They say she performed the rituals, circled the pyre, touched her husband's feet, and climbed onto the funeral pyre to sit beside his corpse. They say she sat there, waiting for the fire. They say many things. But what we know is that the flames were lit, and Roop Kanwar was burned alive as hundreds watched. Some chanting, some praying, some standing in silence as the smoke billowed, and the screams were swallowed by the crackle of burning wood. The villagers would later claim it was her choice, that she embraced the flames willingly, that she chose to become a Sati martyr, a living goddess through the agony of fire. But others whispered that she was drugged, that she was pressured, that she was trapped by the expectations of a community that saw her death not as a tragedy, but as a spectacle of faith and purity. When news of her death reached the outside world, it ignited a firestorm of outrage across India and beyond. Protests erupted, demanding justice, demanding accountability, demanding an end to the barbarity, that had claimed Roop's life in the name of tradition. The government was forced to act, passing new laws to strengthen the ban on Sati, declaring it illegal to glorify or support the ritual, threatening punishment for those who would dare to encourage or participate in the burning of another widow. But even as the laws were passed, the reality on the ground remained complex. In the village where Roop Kanwar died, some erected a shrine in her honor, worshipping her ashes, declaring her a goddess, a martyr who had upheld the purity of tradition. Roop's story is not ancient history. It is a reminder that the flames of Sati, though illegal, still found fuel in the hearts of those who believed in its sanctity. In the crushing silence of women taught that death was holier than survival. But Roop was not the first, and she would not be the last. Long before cameras could capture the smoke rising, long before the world could bear witness to the screams, there were thousands of women who burned in silence. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as the British East India Company spread its grip across the Indian subcontinent, British officials stationed in Bengal began to take notice of the fires that burned with disturbing regularity. They recorded case after case, noting with cold bureaucratic precision the numbers, the dates, the locations, the names of the women who climbed onto funeral pyres, never to return. In Bengal alone, it is estimated that hundreds of women were burned alive every single year. They describe scenes that haunted even the hardened colonial officers who witnessed them. Villages gathering before dawn. The air thick with the scent of smoke and ghee, the crackle of wood, and the rhythmic chants of priests as the pyre was prepared. They saw women, some trembling, some drugged with opium, some tied with ropes to prevent escape, placed upon the pyre beside their dead husbands, their faces hidden by veils that could not hide the fear in their eyes. They saw flames lit as families watched, mothers holding children close, telling them to remember this moment as a lesson in devotion, in purity, in the price of honor. And they saw the women's bodies twisting in the flames, the robes catching fire, the screams piercing the chants, the desperate attempts to rise, to escape, to live, met with the brutal hands of those who forced them back into the fire, pushing them down with poles, with sticks, with heavy logs, until their cries fell silent, and the only sound left was the crackle of burning flesh. They recorded the ages of these women. Some were 30, some were 20, but many were far younger. Among the ashes of Sati lie the stories of children, girls as young as 12 years old, married off to men decades older, widowed before they ever became women, before they even understood the weight of the red robes placed upon them. These girls, widowed at 12, 13, 14, became the property of death, their childhood stolen, their futures erased by the expectation that they would climb onto the pyre and die because their husbands had died. They were told it was their duty, that the gods demanded it, that to refuse was to condemn themselves to a life of shame, poverty, and isolation, to wander the earth as cursed shadows. And so they were led to the pyre, their small bodies draped in bridal silks, their faces hidden, their hands trembling as they were guided by mothers, by priests, by neighbors who told them this was their destiny, their only path to purity. They died in the flames, their screams a brief moment of truth in a world that demanded their silence. They died, and their ashes were swept away, their names forgotten, their lives reduced to a footnote in the dusty pages of colonial records. These are not legends. These are not myths. These are the true stories of women and girls burned alive in the name of honor, purity, and tradition. They are stories of a world where a woman's worth was measured by her willingness to die, where a community's honor was built upon the ashes of its daughters. They are stories that remind us that the flames of Sati did not burn in isolation. They burned because society chose to feed them, because silence allowed them, because fear enforced them. They burned in crowded fields, in hidden clearings, by rivers that carried the ashes downstream, washing away the evidence, but never the guilt. They burned, leaving behind the ghosts of women who deserved to live, who deserved to grow old, who deserved to see the sunrise not through smoke, but with hope. The story of Sati is not just a story of fire. It is a story of fear, of control, of the violence that tradition can inflict upon women under the guise of devotion. It is a story of screams that once echoed across the dawn and the silence that followed, leaving the world to forget. But we will not forget. Not here. Not now. Not ever. Even as the flames of Sati burned, even as crowds gathered to watch women climb onto funeral pyres, there were voices that rose against the fire. Not all of India was silent. Not all bowed to the weight of tradition. In the early 19th century, as the sun rose over Bengal's rivers and fields, so too rose the voice of Raja Ram Mohan Roy, a scholar, a reformer, a man who could not stand to watch another woman's body be swallowed by the flames while society called it purity. Raja Ram Mohan Roy was no foreigner. He was born of the same soil that had seen the ashes of countless widows. He knew the scriptures, the philosophies, the spiritual weight that people used to justify Sati, and he stood against it. He argued that the practice was not true Hinduism, that the ancient texts, when read with honesty, did not demand the death of a widow on her husband's pyre. He pointed out that Sati was a corruption, a distortion, a tradition built on fear and power, not on faith. And he was not alone. Across India, in whispers at first, and then in louder voices, other scholars, community leaders, and families began to reject the flames. Many Hindu communities had never practiced Sati. Others quietly stepped away, refusing to continue a tradition that had turned into horror. There were those who risked their reputations, who risked being labeled traitors to tradition, to speak the simple truth, that a woman's life did not belong to the pyre, that her worth did not end with her husband's last breath. But fighting tradition was like trying to extinguish a fire that kept finding new fuel. For every family that chose to protect their daughters, there were others who continued to see the flames as sacred. And while India wrestled with its conscience, another force was watching: the British colonial administration. At first, the British East India Company, driven by profit and power, avoided interfering with the religious customs of the people they ruled. They saw themselves as traders, not reformers, and they knew that to touch the fires of Sati was to risk angering the powerful classes, whose cooperation they needed to maintain control. But the British officers could not look away forever. They saw the smoke rising in Bengal, heard the screams of burning women, read the cold reports of how many widows were burned each year, how many girls were lost to the flames, before they even had a chance to live. Pressure began to build. Missionaries, humanitarian voices in Britain, and even some within the colonial administration began to speak out, framing Sati not only as a religious practice, but as a moral stain that could not be ignored. Arguments raged in offices and parlours, in India and in London. Some argued that to ban Sati was to violate the promise of non-interference in religion. Others argued that allowing it to continue was inhuman, a crime that could not be tolerated. At the centre of this debate was a simple question: was it worth angering the powerful to save the powerless? And so, in December of 1889, under the leadership of Governor General Lord William Bentinck, the Bengal Sati regulation was enacted. The regulation declared the practice of Sati illegal in Bengal. It stated that any person who abetted, encouraged, or assisted in the burning of a widow would be charged with culpable homicide, punishable by the full extent of the law. The flames of Sati were now, officially, a crime. Over time, the ban spread to other regions under British control. Enforcement was often uneven, and in many places, the law was met with resistance, protests, and even riots by those who saw it as an attack on tradition and faith. But the tide had turned. With each year that passed, the practice of sati became less common. The fires that once burned openly began to sputter under the weight of law and growing public condemnation. Yet even with the law, the ashes of sati did not settle easily. In hidden corners, in isolated villages, the ritual continued in whispers and in smoke, away from the eyes of the world. Families who clung to old beliefs, to the fear of dishonor, still led their daughters to the pyre. The death of Rup Kanwar in 1987 proved that while the law could ban a practice, it could not erase the beliefs that fed it. Her death was a reminder that traditions rooted in fear and control do not die easily. That the battle against sati was not just about passing laws, but about changing the hearts and minds of those who believed that a woman's worth was found only in her death. In the end, the abolition of sati was not the work of a single law, a single ruler, or a single reformer. It was the combined force of Indian reformers like Roger Ram Mohan Roy, Hindu scholars who spoke out, communities who refused to continue the practice, and the intervention of the British colonial government, pressured by moral outrage. It was the result of courage, of those who stood beside the pyres and said, "No more." The flames of sati were extinguished not in a single moment, but through the slow, painful struggle of generations who refused to let the screams of burning women remain a part of the dawn chorus in India. Sati is now banned, illegal, and condemned. But its story remains, a reminder of how belief, when twisted, can justify horror, and how silence can feed the flames. It is a reminder that the fight to protect the vulnerable is never truly over, and that history, when left unchecked, can repeat itself in ash and blood. Today, sati is illegal. It is condemned, prosecuted, and rejected by modern India. But the shadows of the flames remain in the collective memory of a nation. Echoes are screams that once rose with the dawn, reminders of daughters, mothers, and wives burned in the name of honor. Sati reflects the brutal intersection of patriarchy, twisted religious interpretation, and societal pressure that once demanded a woman's death to prove her worth. It stands as a warning of how tradition can be weaponized to justify cruelty, how faith can be twisted into fear, and how silence can become complicity. These stories are not told to shame, but to remember, because history, when forgotten, has a way of returning. The flames of sati have long died out, but the stories of the women who were forced to burn remain as a haunting testament to how society can fail its most vulnerable. Their stories remind us of the danger when tradition and cruelty merge, turning sacred rituals into instruments of death.